A sudden naval skirmish unfolding thousands of miles away in a narrow strait can completely paralyze a domestic economy almost overnight. To counter this threat, the Indian Prime Minister recently issued 7 distinct behavioral directives to the public, most notably an appeal to prioritize working from home and to halt gold purchases entirely for a year. Deploying state-mandated austerity measures is standard practice during a declared economic contraction. Implementing them when the domestic economy is officially growing points to a completely different class of crisis. The root cause lies in the Strait of Hormuz. The ongoing geopolitical conflict has delivered an exogenous supply shock to global oil and gas markets on a scale that requires immediate defensive action. To understand the defense strategy, we have to look at India's foreign exchange reserves. Think of this as a massive, stabilizing reservoir of capital, currently sitting at roughly $690 to $700 billion. External supply shocks act as structural release valves. When importing essential energy spikes, the state aggressively drains those reserves to cover the sudden deficit. As capital drains, the rupee's valuation declines in inverse correlation, risking a dangerous trajectory toward 95 to 1 against the US dollar. When a central bank cannot physically fix a broken international supply chain, it relies on demand-side management. This is a mechanism designed to artificially suppress public consumption until equilibrium returns. These 7 appeals function as a coordinated mathematical strategy to defend India's balance of payments through immediate demand destruction. That macro-level capital defense is tied directly to physical infrastructure. Domestic energy grids depend heavily on massive volumes of imported Middle Eastern fuel. Because regular natural gas shipments from Qatar are currently disrupted, the state faces an immediate bottleneck in its capacity to manufacture domestic urea fertilizer. Facing this localized chemical shortage, the government is urging an immediate pivot to natural farming techniques, utilizing rapid behavioral changes to bypass the broken supply chain. The calculus for transportation fuel is even tighter. India's strategic petroleum reserves hold enough capacity to cover a maximum of 2 to 3 months of national consumption. With Russia scaling back its previous crude oil discounts, the threat of importing inflation grows with every single barrel purchased at a premium. This dashboard illustrates the core objective. By urging citizens to work from home and delay foreign travel, the state aims to artificially suppress inelastic demand. Every drop in commuter fuel usage instantly translates to a reduction in dollar outflows. Curbing millions of daily commutes is the fastest, most direct lever the government can pull to slow the draining of the Forex reservoir. India is not executing this playbook in isolation. Nations like the Philippines and Vietnam are issuing identical fuel conservation mandates to their citizens. To see the worst-case scenario of unsuppressed demand, look at Sri Lanka, where total supply failure left citizens waiting indefinitely with empty plastic jugs. The fact that multiple governments are simultaneously restricting commuter habits confirms this is a widespread exogenous shock rather than an isolated domestic policy failure. The risk of escalation remains high. Key geopolitical actors indicate the conflict is expanding, meaning these supply constraints will likely persist. When international supply is perfectly inelastic and national reserves have a hard limit, demand destruction becomes the only mathematical tool to keep an economy functional. Halting gold purchases for an entire year is the most complex directive because it asks middle-class citizens to override their own deep-seated financial instincts. India manufactures virtually none of its own gold. Every ounce of this cultural necessity must be imported from abroad. As this model shows, that dependency creates a massive $72 billion annual outflow on the state balance sheet, actively draining the national forex reserve. To finance this import, massive quantities of domestic rupees must be sold on the open market to purchase dollars, directly driving the rupee's valuation down into the red. But the right side of our model reveals a conflicting reality. On the household balance sheet, families utilize those very same gold blocks to build a protective wall around their savings. This is classic inflation hedging. Citizens turn to tangible, historically stable assets to protect their life savings from the steady depreciation of fiat currency. The middle class acts with stark rationality here. They buy gold specifically because they see the purchasing power of the rupee steadily declining. This creates a direct micro-macro paradox. The state demands citizens stop buying gold to save the rupee, which collides perfectly with the household's need to buy gold because the rupee is falling. With alternative, highly stable financial safe havens largely inaccessible to the average earner, the options for wealth preservation are remarkably thin. During a geopolitical war, this individual hedging behavior places immense, compounding pressure on the nation's overall balance of payments. The government is effectively asking citizens to act against their own immediate financial interests, abandoning their primary safe haven during a period of high inflation to subsidize the aggregate stability of the nation. This reliance on citizen sacrifice has drawn heavy political critique from the opposition, who frame the appeals as absolute proof of failed economic policy. The core argument asserts that a decade of centralized governance should have built sufficient structural resilience to shield the public from sudden lifestyle regressions. To evaluate this critique, we must look at how states historically respond to severe supply shocks, like the rationing seen during the 1970s global oil crisis. This matrix charts historical economic crises. The x-axis tracks time, from the 1970s through the 1991 Indian balance of payments crisis up to 2024. The y-axis scales the policy response, from slow structural repair up to immediate behavioral suppression. Structural resilience means achieving total domestic energy independence. Behavioral suppression means rationing. As plotted here, the sudden shocks of the 70s and 1991 both required extreme behavioral suppression to maintain basic stability. Plotting the 2024 response reveals the exact same pattern. Sudden geopolitical threats, like the risk of undersea internet cables being severed, cannot be neutralized by long-term structural policies implemented a decade ago. When a war erupts overnight and cuts off a major shipping lane, central banks cannot simply invent physical supply out of thin air. Critiques demanding long-term structural planning hold weight in peacetime, but when facing an overnight, massive disruption to global logistics, behavioral demand suppression is the only viable emergency lever remaining. Ultimately, these 7 appeals function mechanically as an extreme emergency valve, aggressively tightened to halt the hemorrhaging of national capital reserves. This response highlights a shift in how global conflict operates, where local stability is inextricably tied to distant naval logistics. The speed of transmission is staggering. A naval skirmish taking place thousands of miles away now dictates the terms of a domestic commute within days. The result is a series of precise, localized lifestyle regressions expected of the citizen, canceling foreign vacations, abandoning preferred global brands, and actively altering daily consumption habits. This dynamic represents a direct transfer of financial risk. The pressure is moved off the sovereign state's balance sheet and placed squarely onto the individual's wallet. Every delayed vacation and skipped commute serves a singular mathematical purpose, preventing the rupee from breaching that critical 95 to the dollar threshold. Without this localized friction suppressing domestic demand, the entire national import framework would rapidly collapse under the weight of a heavily depreciated currency. The unwritten rule of this modern defense strategy is as simple as it is severe. The middle class is continuously drafted to act as the primary financial